Welcome to Psalms, Layer by Layer, a project of Scriptura. In this video, we will walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 18. These are issues that anyone doing serious study of this psalm is going to have to deal with, and each of these 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 18, the top 3 issues are there Preterite Yiqtols in Psalm 18? The non-intial Yiqtols of Psalm 18, 1 through 20, and the form and meaning of Nichatha in Psalm 18:35. The first of our top exegetical issues in Psalm 18. Are there Preterite Yiqtols in Psalm 18? Consider Psalm 18:17. In the standard Hebrew text, this verse reads, Yishlach mimarom yikacheni. Yamsheni memayim rabim. Notice that the 3 verbs in this verse are all Yiqtol verbs. Yishlach, Yikacheni, and Yamsheni. The Yiqtol verb form is normally associated with either posterior semantics, that is, referring to an event that takes place after some sort of reference point, or with modal semantics, that is, it expresses some sort of stance towards a non-actual event, such as the degree of obligation to perform the action or the level of certainty that the event will take place. Nearly every English translation, however, translates these verbs with the English preterite, that is, with past time reference and perfective aspect. For example, the ESV translates the verse as, He sent, Yishlach, from on high, He took me, Yikacheni, He drew me, Yamsheni, out of many waters. This choice of verbal semantics raises 2 important questions that we will address in this exegetical issue. 1. Could Biblical Hebrew ever express a past perfective event with Yiqtol? And 2. If it could, would we expect to find this Yiqtol in Psalm 18? Let's now look at each question more closely. First, does Biblical Hebrew have, or did it ever have, a Preterite Yiqtol? The biggest problem with allowing for a Preterite Yiqtol is that it would overlap too much with the morphological alternative katal, which is normally associated with Preterite semantics. Within this line of argumentation, most clause-initial Yiqtols are given alternative analyses. For example, one scholar argues that all cases of clause-initial Yiqtols in past context should be understood with an elided pronoun before it, so that the following verb offers a comment and describes what the referent of that pronoun habitually does. In other words, we are compelled to read it as having imperfective, not perfective aspect. Thus, in Deuteronomy 32:8, which says, Yatsev gvulot amim, He fixed the borders of the peoples, we are to understand the text as saying, Hu Yatsev gvulot amim. As for Him, He would fix the borders of the people. Another example of an alternative analysis is that Yiqtols in past contexts should be read as historical present, that is, as portraying the events in real time in order to make them more vivid. Thus, in 1 Samuel 2:19, we should read Uma'il katon ta'asello imo as something like, so his mother makes him a little robe, and then, rather than, and his mother made him a little robe. The problem with these alternative analyses is that while they could work in some places, there are others where they simply cannot. For example, in Job 3:3, Yovad yom ivaled bo, which we can only read as may the day perish on which I was born. Reading on which I am born or on which, as for me, I am habitually born would not make much sense. Additionally, we find the exact same expression in Jeremiah 20:14 with the katal form. Arur hayom asher yuladti bo, cursed be the day on which I was born. Thus, there are places where the expected values of Yiqtol simply do not work. There is also historical precedence for the existence of a Preterite Yiqtol in Biblical Hebrew. It is almost certain that Hebrew's ancestor had short vowels on verbs that expressed information about their verbal semantics. The form associated with present and future time, as well as with continuous semantics, would have been yaktulu, whereas the form associated with perfective semantics would have taken the pattern Yiqtol. In another daughter language of Hebrew's ancestor language, this is exactly what we find. In one text of this language, which is Amarna Canaanite, we read, I have heeded, ishteme, the Yiqtol form, I've heeded the words which the king, my lord, sent to his servant. Now I am guarding, and now I am heeding, ishtemu, the Yiqtol form. The form that ended in u, ishtemu, expresses an action in progress, whereas a form of the same word that did not end in u, ishteme, did not. One clue that this distinction between Yiqtol forms survived in Biblical Hebrew is the form of the third-person pronominal suffix on Yiqtol forms. Sometimes the suffix has a nun in it, like yishalchenu, and sometimes it does not, yishalchehu. There is good evidence to suppose that the form with the nun reflects the present, future, and imperfective Yiqtolu form, while the form without the nun reflects the past perfective Yiqtol form. See our Exegetical Issues page for more detail. For example, in Psalm 8, while reflecting on the past act of creation and how God distinguished human beings from the rest of creation, the psalmist recounts in verse 6, V'chavod v'hadar te'atrehu, and you crowned him with honor and majesty. The form te'atrehu uses the suffix without nun. The past interpretation is confirmed by the LXX's usage of an aorist here, estephanosas, you crowned. Finally, instances should be noted where names with a Yiqtol element in an earlier book appear with a katal element in a later book, suggesting that the katal began to overtake the function of a Yiqtol. For example, we find the name Yiftach El opened in Joshua 19:27, whereas the name Pathachya, Yah opened in Ezra 10:23. Considering these points, it therefore seems possible that Biblical Hebrew always had, or at least at one time had, a preterite Yiqtol. But would we expect to find this in Psalm 18? The point made earlier about names would suggest that the preterite Yiqtol would have at least been operative in an earlier stage of the language. This is confirmed when we look at other texts that scholars agree represent archaic Biblical Hebrew. One example is Deuteronomy 32. Verse 10 reads, Yimtsa'ehu be'eretz midbar, uvethohu yilel yeshimon, yisovavenhu, yivonanehu, yitzarenhu ka'ishon eino. Many English translations take these Yiqtols as preterite. In this respect, note the H suffixes. In the ESV, we read, He found him in a desert land and in the howling waste of the wilderness. He encircled him. He cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. Even the LXX translates all of these Yiqtol forms with aorists. Autarkesen, he made himself sufficient, for Yimtsa'ehu. Ekiklosen, he encircled him, for Yisovavenhu. Epairosen, he educated him, for Yivonanehu. And Deaphylaxen, he guarded him, for Yitzarenhu. Having established that preterite Yiqtol is an archaic feature, does Psalm 18 have an archaic profile? Some scholars would say no, and point to some other linguistic features that are normally characteristic of late texts. For example, the nun of the preposition min remains unassimilated in a few words within the psalm. Thus, in verse 4, we have min oivai instead of me oivai, from my enemies. And in verse 49, we have min qamai instead of miqamai, from those who rise up against me. While this observation is valid, it has two problems. First, it does not take into account the parallel text in 2 Samuel 22. Many of the spelling features there suggest a very early composition. See the Exegetical Issue page for more details. In fact, in the example just given of the unassimilated nun of min, the form miqamai comes from the verse in 2 Samuel 22, parallel to Psalm 18:49's min qamai. Second, there are some thematic affiliations with agreed-upon archaic poems. For example, the theophany in verses 8 through 16 is strongly reminiscent of the same theme that is found in texts like Habakkuk 3 and Exodus 15. In fact, literary and thematic connections like these led one scholar to say the literary associations with Exodus 15, Habakkuk 3, Deuteronomy 32 and 33, Micah 7, and Psalm 144 point to a relatively early date for the composition of the psalm. Thus, not only may we have confidence that Hebrew at one point had a Preterite Yiqtol, but Psalm 18 and 2 Samuel 22 is the type of composition where we would expect to find such an archaic feature. We therefore accept the possibility of Preterite Yiqtol in Psalm 18. In our own analysis, we interpret Yiqtols in verses 12, 17, 18, 19, 37, 38, and 39 as Preterite. See our verbal semantics page on Psalm 18 for more details. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest and D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a B rating. The second issue is somewhat related to the first and has to do with all of the non-initial Yiqtols in Psalm 18 verses 1 through 20. In this section, the psalmist recounts past instances of God's deliverance, and in verses 5b, 8b, 9b, and 14a, a line containing a non-initial Yiqtol immediately follows a line containing either katal or vayiqtol. This creates a difficulty in accounting for the actual semantics of the Yiqtol, that is, what the Yiqtol contributes to the larger meaning within these couplets. We will use Psalm 18:5 as a representative case. In the standard Hebrew text, the verse reads, Afafuni chevle mavet, v'nachale v'liya'al Yiva'athuni, which we may translate, the breaker waves of death surrounded me, and the torrents of no return something. The root Beit Ayin Tav in the PL means to overwhelm. As for the verbal semantics of the form, translations reflect three major options. The first option is to understand the Yiqtol here as expressing preterite semantics. That is, past time reference and perfective aspect. This can be seen in the ESV's translation. The torrents of destruction assailed me. The second option is to read the Yiqtol here as expressing progressive semantics in a past tense context. This is seen in the BDS's translation. Et comme un torrent destructeur me terrifiait. Finally, the NJB reflects an interpretation where verse 15b is future with regard to the event expressed in 15a, that is, a future in the past. With death's breakers closing in on me, Beliaal's torrents ready to swallow me. Let us look at each of these options. The first option is to interpret Yiva'athuni as preterite, like the ESV's the torrents of destruction assailed me. One piece of evidence for this is the context. This is clearly a past tense context, and the previous line uses katal, afafuni. The use of Yiqtol here is therefore intended to elicit some poetic effect instead of marking a change in time reference. While all of this may be true, the poetic effect is just that, an effect. It does not explain on what basis the effect has its force. In other words, it does not clarify the actual meaning of the form, which then contributes to the overall effect. It therefore ultimately leaves the switch from katal to Yiqtol unexplained. Another possible piece of evidence for the preterite reading is the very possibility of having preterite Yiqtol, as explained in the last issue. The problem here has to do with the position of the verb. In general, the preterite Yiqtols in Psalm 18 are all clause initial, and this pattern seems to hold across archaic texts. One scholar notes that in archaic biblical Hebrew, preterite Yiqtol is mainly clause initial, and other uses of Yiqtol are commonly non-initial. Indeed, we find this pattern in Deuteronomy 32, which most would agree is an archaic text. Compare the following instances of clause initial Yiqtol versus non-initial Yiqtol. For example, in verse 8, he fixed the boundaries of the people, Yatsev gvulot amim, versus verse 3, for I will proclaim the name of the Lord, Kishem Adonai Ekra, or verse 10, he found him in a desert land. Yimtsa'ehu be'eretz midbar. Versus verse 21. So I will make them jealous. Ve'ani akni'em. Examples could be multiplied. The second option is to interpret yiva'athuni as a past progressive, in which the form would mean something like, they were overwhelming me. We saw this translation in the BDS's miterifaye. The problem with this interpretation is that it is simply ungrammatical. Yiqtol does not express progressive aspect in the indicative. Rather, it is the participle kotel that expresses progressive aspect in the indicative. In other places in Scripture, however, some English translations interpret Yiqtols in past tense context as progressive. In 2 Samuel 15:37, for example, the ESV has, So Hushai, David's friend, came into the city just as Absalom was entering Jerusalem. Va'avshalom yavo Yerushalayim. Notice, however, that in this example, the Yiqtol verb, yavo, is non-initial. We argue that there is a better option available, which brings us to the final option. Recall that the NJB exemplified a future in the past interpretation of Yiva'athuni. With death's breakers closing in on me, Bliya al's torrents ready to swallow me. In this translation, the swallowing, Yiva'athuni, was to happen shortly after the point to which closing in on me applies. We want to argue for a kind of future in the past interpretation here, very close to this one, namely an ingressive. That is, where the Yiqtol expresses the beginning of an action. Thus, the meaning of Yiva'athuni would be, they began to overwhelm me. First, this interpretation fits with the semantics of the Yiqtol, which we understand as fundamentally expressing a posterior relation. That is, one thing happening after some point of reference. See our Verbal Semantics Creator Guidelines for more details. Posteriority may imply ingressive semantics. If the thing that is posterior is the completion of an event, then that implies that the event has already begun. If we apply this interpretation to non-initial Yiqtols in past tense context elsewhere in Scripture, it yields a good sense every time. Some examples. In 2 Samuel 15:37, Hushai, David's friend, came into the city while Absalom began to enter Jerusalem. Va'avshalom yavo b'Yerushalayim. In Isaiah 6:4, and the foundations of the threshold shook from the voice of the caller as the house began to be filled with smoke. V'habayit yimale ashan. Psalm 78:20, he struck the rock and water poured out, and streams began to overflow. V'nachalim yishtofu. Finally, an ingressive reading would make good sense out of all the non-initial Yiqtols in the first half of Psalm 18, including verse 5, our test case. Thus, in verse 8, we would have, the earth then quivered and quaked as the mountains began to shake. Umosdei harim yirgazu. In verse 9, we have, smoke went up from his snarl, as fire from his mouth began to consume. Va'esh mipiv tochel. And in verse 14, we'd have, and the Lord thundered from the heavens as the Most High began to raise his voice. Va'elion yeten kolo. We therefore understand these non-initial Yiqtols as ingressives. Verse 5 would therefore be translated as, the breaker waves of death surrounded me, as the torrents of Belial began to overwhelm me. V'nachalei v'liya'al yiva'athuni. The breaker waves of death surrounded me as the torrents of no return began to overwhelm me. V'nachalei v'liya'al yiva'athuni. If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, we would give this interpretation a B rating. The third issue is the form and meaning of nichatha in Psalm 18:35. The first line of Psalm 18:35 in the standard Hebrew text says, Milamed yadai la milchama, which we may translate as, he trains my hands for war. The second line reads, Vanichatha keshet nechusha zro'otai. The phrase keshet nechusha means a bow of bronze, and the phrase zro'otai means my arms. This exegetical issue will focus on the first word of that line, which is the verb vanichatha. We will be concerned with its textual form, its syntax, and its meaning. Note that throughout this discussion, we will assume that the root of this word is nun chet tav. Let us first look at the first two issues together, the form and the syntax, since they are closely related. If we compare the consonants of the Psalms text with the parallel passage in the Samuel text, we find nun chet tav he in Psalms versus nun chet tav in Samuel. These two strings of consonants basically give three options, each of which we will now assess. The first option is to read the consonants nun chet tav he with the Psalms text. The most straightforward reading of these consonants is as a third feminine singular verb, in which case the word would be vocalized as it is in the Psalms text, as nichatha. Indeed, whenever a root ending in tav is inflected for the third feminine singular in the katal conjugation, it normally shows a he in the orthography. Examples include chitatha, she was disheartened, Jeremiah 51:56, shavatha, it rested, Leviticus 25:2, and nichratha, it was cut off, Genesis 17:4. On this reading, the subject of the verb is arms, zra'athai. On this reading, the subject of the verb is my arms, zra'athai. And so the phrase vanichatha keshet nechusha zra'athai could be translated as something like we see in the ESV, so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. The best argument for this option is that there would be gender agreement between the verb vanichatha and its subject zra'athai, since both would be feminine. While there would indeed be gender agreement, however, the constituent would lack number agreement, since the verb vanichatha is singular and the noun zra'ot is plural. We should therefore try to look for a more satisfactory option. The second option is to read the consonants nun chet tav with the Samuel text. These consonants could be vocalized in two possible ways, which thus generate two more possible options for the form and syntax of this verb. The first possible vocalization of nun chet tav is as a second person masculine singular verb, nichata, in which case God is the subject of the clause. We find a second person verb, for example, in the Old Greek. The translation of this verse, Kai ethu toxon chalkun tus brachionas mu, in my arms you made a bronze bow. The fact that this interpretation is reflected in the Old Greek is one argument for this reading. Another good argument is that parsing the consonants nun chet tav as a second masculine singular form explains how the he in the form vanichatha could have arisen. Namely, the he could simply represent a fuller spelling of nichata, that is, nichata with the final he serving as the vowel letter orthographically. We accept that the form nun chet tav explains how nun chet tav he could have arisen, and is probably more original. We prefer to parse it, however, as a third masculine singular form, nichath, instead of a second masculine singular form. As a third masculine singular, God is still the subject, but is addressed in the third person instead of the second. This interpretation may be seen in the NLT's translation. He strengthens my arm to draw a bronze bow. This option has two big advantages. First, it has ancient support. This reading is reflected in Aquila and Symmachus. But, more importantly, this is actually the exact form seen in the Samuel version of this psalm, vanichat. The second big advantage of taking nun chet tav as a third masculine singular over the second masculine singular reading is that this avoids a sudden person shift within the same verse. God, referenced in the third person, is the subject of the verbs in the previous two verses as well as in the first line of this verse, starting in verse 33. The God who arms me with strength and makes my endeavor secure, he makes my feet like those of a deer, and he causes me to stand upon my heights. He trains my hands for war. If we interpreted the nun chet tav verb as second person nichata, we would get a sudden shift in verse 35. He trains my hands for war, and you. With the third person interpretation, this sudden shift is avoided, and the third person reference is maintained. He trains my hands for war, and he, nichath. We therefore prefer to read the consonants nun, chet, tav, vocalized as a third person singular masculine form with God as the subject, in which case the form would be nichath. But we must now turn to the question of what this word means. One option is to interpret the word as meaning bend, as seen in the ESVs, so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. This interpretation requires taking arms as the subject, which we have already seen is not preferable. But even if we set this consideration aside, the meaning bend would still have problems. Presumably, the meaning bend is derived from nachat's meaning in the kal, to descend, as seen, for example, in Job 17:6. Shall we descend, nachat, together into the dust? In the PL, the meaning would be something like to make descend, i.e. to bend, with the reference being either to stepping on a bow in order to string it, or to physically drawing back the bow. If the reference is to stepping on the bow in order to string it, then this does not fit the context very well. The previous verses make it clear that God is giving the psalmist strength, not the specific skill of stringing a bow. Neither can it be argued that the reference is to drawing the bowstring, such that it descends. First, while the top of the bow would indeed descend when the string is drawn, the bottom of the bow ascends. Second, drawing back a bow is usually expressed by the verb mashach, as in the verse, and a man drew back, mashach, his bow. 1 Kings 22:34. The second option is to interpret nichath as to aim. This would require revocalizing the verb to nachitha, a second person masculine singular verb from the root nun, chet, he, to lead, with the idea being that God leads the psalmist's arms to use the bow of bronze, that is, to aim it. A translation similar to this is seen in the CEV. You teach my hands to fight, and my arms to use a bow of bronze. But this option is unlikely for two reasons. First, the spelling nachitha without the he would be very unusual, as third he verbs in the kal perfect second masculine singular are virtually always spelled with he. Second, as we saw earlier, this would require a sudden person shift to the second person. The final option is to interpret the nun, chet, tav verb as to strengthen. This option has many advantages. First, it fits the context very well. As one scholar notes, the immediate literary context focuses on the gift of divine strength to the king's feet and hands. Second, this root has cognates in other Northwest Semitic languages. For example, in one Ugaritic text we read, "As for El, his staff is powerful," nun, chet, tav. Earlier, however, we said that the nun, chet, tav verb means to descend in the kal. How then could it mean to strengthen here? It has been suggested by some scholars that another root with nun, chet, tav was borrowed into Hebrew from Egyptian, where it meant strength. We find evidence for this borrowing in Isaiah 30:30, where, in an oracle against Egypt itself, this word is used, thereby imbuing the statement with irony. God will make his glorious voice heard, and he will show the strength, nachath, of his arm. The strength of his arm makes much better sense than the descent of his arm. Syntactically, we know that verbs expressing supporting or furnishing may take double objects, as in Judges 19:5, for example. Sa'ad libbacha pat lechem. Strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread. Similarly, here in Psalm 18:35, the thing being strengthened is my arms, zro'athai, and the thing the subject of nichath, God, is using to strengthen that first object is the bow of bronze, keshet nechusha. The idea is therefore that God strengthens the psalmist by giving him a powerful weapon. We find nearly the exact same idea in Ezekiel 30:24. And I will strengthen the arms of the king of Babylon and put my sword in his hand. By way of summary, we therefore emend the consonants from nun, chet, tav, he to nun, chet, tav, and vocalize nun, chet, tav as nichath, which we interpret as a PL third person katal, whose stem means to strengthen, We therefore understand verse 35 to mean, "He trains my hands for war, and he strengthens my arms with a bow of bronze." How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. Issues 1 and 2 have massive implications for distinguishing when the psalmist is narrating past events versus when he is describing characteristic events. Issue 3 offers a solution that maintains continuity within its larger context. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 18, in which we explore the difficult and most important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the psalm, and our poetry video explores the beauty of the psalm as a poem. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at scriptura.org to learn more.